Good evening. I'm in London again, Canary Wharf. I thought today I'd talk a bit about an architecture picture that I've used in describing the functions of a finance platform or an instrument ledger or what might be the basis for a metric engine. There's many different layers to this. We've kind of talked in one of the earlier episodes about the layers of the data supply chain. You'll notice that those layers sit behind this architecture picture as the interface or data capture layer, the post and store layer, and then the report and analyze layer. There's more detail shown on this architecture picture around the other elements, and today I think I'll just give you a brief overview. We'll talk about this architecture picture in upcoming episodes in more detail. The post and store layer is at the heart of this process. I think the process of creating a data supply chain happens in the post and store layer. That's where we take individual transactions and create a balance of some kind, doing away with the transactions and getting to balance-based reporting processes. But to get there first, in so many of our instances for financial reporting today, we don't have the data capture systems aren't in the control of the finance system, the finance area. Finance has to accept data as it exists in all of the business event capture systems that exist in the organization. Finance is responsible for making sure all of those show up on the income statement, the balance sheet, and the other financial reports that are required, but they don't actually own those source systems capturing those business events. So in this architecture picture from a more finance perspective as opposed to an enterprise data supply chain view, we have to have the interface portion of that. This layer is composed in my architecture of two different components because I'm trying to get to a consolidated data supply chain, and the consolidated data supply chain begins with is more around how we store amounts, how we create balances, and the amounts stored on our transaction details. So the accounting rules engine, as we talked about in the data warehousing versus the finance system video, the accounting rules engine is responsible for taking an individual business event and turning it into a debit and credit representation. And it actually has amounts stored on it. The dollar or whatever currency is are stored, those quantitative measures are stored on those transactional records that become out of the accounting rules engine. There are other attributes that are necessary for our pivot processes against an instrument ledger. Those come from the other transformation engine. Those tend to be standardization across different products, different customers, getting to common values, but there aren't balances and there aren't amounts in the same sense stored against those. There might be balances like limits or collateral amounts or loan payment amounts or those kinds of things, but they're not the same transactional quantitative data that we turn into balances. So those kinds of things come through the other transformation engine. At the heart of the posting process is the instrument ledger, which has to take the transactions and post them against yesterday's balances at the lowest level of detail required for our financial reporting. That process takes a lot of scale. Adjunct to that, we have the general ledger. Now, I've in some instances have noted that a general ledger and an instrument ledger have similar sorts of views of the world. One is at a more detailed level. So there's some question, and sometimes I get asked about the level of redundancy at having a general ledger and an instrument ledger. We'll talk about that, I think, in another video another time. But for purposes of our discussion in the simplified world, dealing with where people are willing to talk about in a transformative world, we're probably going to, in the short term, continue to have a general ledger and an instrument ledger until we get more aggressive in thinking about a different kind of financial systems architecture. We also need, in that same process, though, I've talked about analytical events and needing to be able to take balances and sometimes create analytical reports, do modeling, other kinds of statistical analysis or regression analysis. All of that goes on at the bottom of this in the detailed calculation engines. Those pull from the instrument ledger to begin their process, but typically those aren't posting processes that continue to update balances in some way. They're a snapshot-based analytical process. All of this data then at some point goes out to our reporting layers, our reporting and analysis layers. It's difficult for me sometimes to categorize exactly the kinds of reports there are, because there's a lot of different categorization that could go to reporting. You can have different categories by function, you can have different categories by technologies, you can have different kinds of users. So these categories are general categories of reporting. My intent is to show that the data to supply any one of those kinds of reporting processes is possible to come from a consolidated data supply chain, such as shown here. So this architecture picture is a simplified data supply chain architecture that could cover a host of different kind of balance-based reporting, quantitative data analysis needs. We'll talk about this, of course, in future episodes.